Today I'd like to talk to you about the correct way to grind the blade for a jack plane. Surprisingly, if you buy a new jack plane, regardless of what manufacturer, the blade will not be ground correctly. I've spoken to 3 or 4 of the manufacturers about this, and they've all told me the same thing. Their machinery is set up to grind one way, straight across, and that's what they do. So it's not that they're not aware of how a jack plane should be ground, it's that their equipment isn't set to do that. However, what I've found in dealing with vintage tools over the last 30 years is that many users never grind their blade correctly, and the entire time they own that jack plane, they're using it incorrectly. Not so much with older tools. I find with vintage tools, especially ones that are well worn, where you know a craftsman really owned it, those will be ground properly. But tools that were obviously owned by a homeowner or a casual craftsman are often not ground properly. Take, for example, this Stanley Bailey No. 5 jack plane. It's a classic jack plane made about 1910, but it's no different than the copies that are made today. 100-year-old plane, and it still has not had the blade properly ground. We take this blade out. We can notice that somebody has relieved the corners, which is, they're on the right track, but really we want to see a far more pronounced curvature on a jack plane than that. You want a curvature on there such that when you plane, like the bottom of a drawer for example, you run your finger over it, you'll feel those waves of the jack plane. One of the key things that people use to determine whether something's Benchmade or not. So we'll take this blade out and we're ready to grind it. So we flip this cantilever over, the belt is loose. Take this belt off. We're going to start out with a 60 grit belt. That was a 120 we just took off of there. Where are we? Oh, and we're ready to go. Now, the way I like to start, if I'm going to make big changes to a bevel on a plane, rather than trying to grind this, the tool rest here is set for the proper angle to grind this blade. But since we're going to try and change the actual profile of the blade, I like to do that at a 90-degree angle and then go back and put the bevel back on there. The reason being, it's far more likely to burn the blade if you try and change the angle like that, because you're removing a lot of material. Whereas if you blunt it and then work in, you're not grinding on the edge until the actual final moments of the grinding process. So, this machine has a gauge here that shows us which hole to be in. And for 90 degrees we want to be at the bottom hole there. So we loosen this lever here. We take this piece out. And we come down. And now we're in the bottom hole. So you'll notice our tool rest is loose. And then we bring this up and lock the tool rest. And now we are locked in at a 90-degree angle. So let's turn the machine on and do some grinding. That's a nice curvature. That's what we want to see. Now, of course, we're completely blunt here now. Only at the center do we still have a bevel, or an edge, I should say. So let's put the bevel back on. So we want to go back now. Let's grind the bevel at 25 degrees. And we look in the second hole down as the 25-degree hole. So we loosen this, bring it up, and now in the second hole, we'll lock her up, and we're ready to grind. Okay, we've removed that flat that we put on the blade, but this 60 grit ceramic belt leaves a pretty rough surface. So what I'd like to do now is switch to 120 grit aluminum oxide belt. So we flip this cam lever down to loosen the tension on the belt. Slide the belt off of here. Here we have a 120 grit belt. That's beautiful, beautiful bevel. Regardless of whether you buy one of our vintage Stanley planes or one of our new jack planes by Clifton or ECE, or even if you buy a new blade from Ron Hawk for your plane, you still need to go through this process. I'm not aware of any jack plane made today that will come with the blade ready to go. So make sure that you grind it with that curve before you use it, or you won't really be getting jack plane results.